The sound came first. Not a scream exactly, but the raw air-shredding noise a throat makes when it has already learned that screaming does nothing. It lived under the floorboards, pressed into the dirt where the roots of the house drank deep and blind. Down there, fingernails worried at wood until they split and bled. Breath scraped the dark. Bones learned the shape of confinement by heart. Time was not measured in days but in hunger, in thirst, in the slow unthreading of memory. When the house settled at night, when the lamps went dark and the land went quiet, the counting began, scratch by scratch, mark by mark. Proof that someone still existed. The photograph was taken above that place. Two boys stand on a porch, their boots aligned, their shoulders squared as if braced, against a wind that never reached them. Their faces are calm, almost devotional, the kind of calm that comes from obedience practiced too long to question. The boards beneath their feet are clean. The window behind them reflects the sky, the trees, the shape of a respectable home. It does not, at first glance, reveal what was trapped inside. If you're listening to this from somewhere far away, Rom, a city whose streets have forgotten this kind of silence, pause for a moment. Which city are you watching from? And what time is it right now? There are hours when stories like this travel more easily, slipping through the thin places between attention and sleep. The Ozarks in the 1870s were a landscape that taught secrecy. Limestone hills folded in on themselves, hollows swallowed sound. Far. Mess sat miles apart, connected by dirt roads that turned to rivers in the rain and dust in the heat. Families learned early that survival depended on self-containment. What happened inside a house was not discussed beyond its walls. Scripture, land, and blood were the only currencies that mattered. Stone County did not appear on most maps in detail back then, just a name pressed faintly between rye, firs, a suggestion rather than a place. Census records were sparse. Church ledgers carried more weight than law. A man's reputation, once set, hardened like cured wood. The Halloway name had that hardness to it. It was spoken without warmth, but without suspicion. A working family, a God-fearing family, a quiet family. Orville Halloway built his house the way he lived his life, squared, reinforce. Closed. Neighbors remembered the fields first, always orderly, rose straight enough to please the eye and the Lord. The twins followed him everywhere, two shadows stitched together at the heel. Elias and Silas. Names pulled from Scripture, heavy with expectation. They were born minutes apart and raised as if separation were a sin. When one moved, the other moved. When one spoke, the other finis. Had the thought or did not speak at all. Their mother was rarely mentioned. When she was, it was in the past tense of health. Frail, unwell, resting, and beneath the house, where no visitor was invited and no prayer was spoken aloud, the counting continued. Stone County learned early not to ask too many questions of the land or the families who claimed it. The hills answered curiosity with akshi, dense. A wrong step could mean a broken leg miles from help. A wrong word could mean a door quietly closed to you forever. So, when Orville Halloway spoke of duty and silence, people listened. When he spoke of sickness, they nodded. Illness was a familiar visitor in those years, and women bore its blame more often than its mercy. The Halloway farm sat where the timber thinned and the soil turned stubborn. Old maps show the property marked with a neat rectangle, as if geometry could tame the place. But the ground there was restless. Springs ran shallow beneath the surface, cold and metallic. Roots twisted deep, prying at stone. The house itself was raised just enough to keep damp from the floorboards, but not enough to banish what waited below. A root cellar was common then, practical, necessary. A place to keep potatoes through winter. A place where air moved slowly and sound moved not at all. Orville was a man who believed rot could be disciplined into obedience. His Bible was worn thin at certain passages, the pages darkened by oil from his hands. He read aloud in the evenings, his voice steady, his sons seated close, their backs straight, their eyes fixed forward. He spoke of or of the danger of unchecked weakness, of serpents that entered a house when vigilance failed. These were not sermons meant for the church, they were instructions. The twins absorbed them without visible resistance. They had been taught since infancy that thought was a communal act, that doubt was a kind of betrayal. When neighbors saw them working the fields, they noted how neither laughed, how neither lingered, how their faces seemed older than their years, set into expressions carved by repetition rather than experience. Children elsewhere played at becoming men. Elias and Silas were already practicing something else entirely. Elias Halloway faded from view with such thoroughness that the town barely noticed when the fading became absence. Letters addressed to her went unanswered. Invitations were declined in Orville's careful hand. She was resting, she was praying, she was unfit for company, the explanations stacked neatly, each one discouraging the next question before it could be asked. At night, the house held its breath. Lamps were extinguished early. The twins' room went dark at the same hour every evening. Below them, behind reinforced boards and iron that had been there when the house was first built, someone listened to the familiar sounds of boots overhead. Each step was known. Each pause carried meaning. Food arrived at regular intervals, slid through a narrow opening, never accompanied by a voice. Water followed. Words did not. Across the small, high window, fingers traced the passage of time. The glass was old and uneven, its surface rippling tea. He whirled beyond into a distortion of light and shadow. Still, the marks accumulated, proof against erasure, proof against madness, proof that the house above was not empty, no matter how convincingly it pretended to be. The twins were born in the spring, when the ground was still cold but the air had begun to soften. Midwives later said the delivery had been long and quiet, the kind that leaves stories worth repeating. 2 boys, healthy, strong-lunged, indistinguishable from the moment they were washed and wrapped. Orville took this as a sign. He recorded their birth in the family ledger with unusual care, noting the hour, the weather, the position of the moon. He wrote that they arrived as 1 act, not 2, and underlined the phrase until the paper nearly tore. From their earliest ours, Elias and Silas were kept close to the house. Other children were allowed to wander, to scrape knees and learn the geography of their own bodies through small rebellions. The twins learned something different. They learned routine. They learned watchfulness. When Annalise withdrew from the world after their birth, the boys were told she was fragile, that noise hurt her, that questions were compassion, they were taught, meant compliance. The whispers began when the twins were old enough to walk to town with their father. People noticed the way they flinched at sudden sound, how their eyes tracked movement the way animals do, alert for threat. They did not play. They observed. When spoken to directly, they answered in careful phrases, as if reciting from memory rather than respo. Deing. Some said the boys seemed older than they should have been. Others said they seemed unfinished, like something essential had been withheld. By the time they were 10, Orville had begun their real education. He took them into the cellar under the pretense of chores. There, in the dim, he taught them about containment, about the dangers of exposure, about the difference between mercy and indulgence. The door was heavy, the iron fittings cold to the touch. He showed them how it closed, how it locked, how sound died once it passed through the wood and stone. This, he told them, was responsibility. Annalise was no longer spoken of as their mother. She became a condition, a problem to be managed. Orville's language stripped her of familiarity and replaced it with doctrine. The boys learn. Her name only as a label attached to warning. Do not listen, do not believe, do not soften. He told them that what came from below was not a woman's voice, but a test. That pity was the first crack in the foundation of a righteous house. At night, when the boys lay in their narrow beds, they heard it anyway. The muffled rhythm of someone moving beneath them, sometimes a thud, like a body shift. Against earth. Sometimes the faintest suggestion of breath pressed through wood. Elias learned to count the seconds between sounds. Silas learned to ignore them. Together, they learned that survival in this house meant alignment. The townspeople noticed that the twins stopped attending school shortly after Annalise vanished from public view. Orville said they were needed at home, that the work was too much for one man. No one argued. Boys were raised for labor, not letters. What no one saw was the way the twins' hands had begun to shake when they carried lanterns into the cellar, or how steady those same hands became once the door was closed. The escalation did not arrive as a single rupture. It seeped in, slow and methodical, like damp creeping up a wall. Orville formalized what had already been happening. He gave names to actions, wrapped them in scripture, carved them into routine. The cellar became a place not just of confinement, but of instruction. Symbols were chalked onto the beams, then re-chalked when moisture blurred them away. Circles, lines, simple shapes that suggested order where none existed. The twins were assigned roles. Elias kept the ledger, Silas kept the key. Neither questioned why these duties had fallen to them, only how to perform them correctly. Their father spoke of balance, of shared burden, of how two minds working in unity could resist temptation where one might fail. He warned them that confusion was the enemy's first tool. That clarity required repetition. Animals on the farm began to go missing. A chicken found dead with no sign of struggle. A goat that refused to enter the barn, its eyes rolling white until it broke free of its tether and fled into the trees. Orville explained these things as signs, tests, proof that corruption spread if not contained. The twins were taken into the woods and shown how to prepare traps, how to dispose of what was no longer useful. Blood became familiar. The smell of it stopped provoking reactio. Inside the house, the nights grew louder. Not louder in volume, but in persistence. The sound from below no longer came in desperate bursts. It became rhythmic, scratching that followed a pattern. Knuckles against glass in deliberate sequence. Elias noted the intervals. Silas memorized the sound of the bolt sliding home. When their father asked them what they heard, they answered correctly. N. He asked them what it meant. They repeated his words back to him without alteration. The twins began to draw. Charcoal scavenged from the hearth, pressed onto scraps of paper. They drew the cellar from memory, every beam and nail rendered with unsettling precision. They drew a woman's face without eyes. They drew a family tree whose branches bent inward, looping back toward the trunk. Orville praised their focus and burned the drawings once he was done with them. Some things, he said, were meant only for instruction, not preservation. Visitors were no longer allowed inside the house. Orville met them on the porch, the twins standing behind him like sentinels. From there, the window reflected only sky and land, and two young men growing increasingly indistinguishable from their father. No one noticed the faint lines beginning to appear on the glass from the inside, or if they did, they told themselves it was nothing. Old houses made marks, old glass distorted light. Down below, the counting continued. The marks grew darker where skin had split. Time lost its shape. The body learned new limits, then exceeded them. What remained was the knowledge that the boys above were no longer boys at all, but something trained, something convinced, something that listened without hearing. The truth did not surface all at once. It folded inward, the way rot works its way through wood, following the grain laid down long before anyone thought to look. Orville's ledger changed in those years. The numbers gave way to language that bent back on itself. He began writing about blood as if T were scripture, about lineage as if it were law. He traced names in the margins, crossing them out, rewriting them, drawing lines where lines should not have been drawn. The family tree he sketched no longer branched outward. It collapsed. Annalise's maiden name appeared again and again in places it should not have been. The same surnames circled each other, generation after generation, stitche. Together by necessity, isolation, and the quiet agreements made in places like Stone County, where land mattered more than consent and silence was considered a virtue. Orville's parents had been cousins. Annalise was more closely related to him than the town ever knew. Blood had been folded back into itself long before the twins were born. The boys were not just sons, they were the consequence. Orville came to believe this made them chosen. purified through repetition, a line kept closed against outside corruption. He told them that other families diluted themselves with strangers, weakening their stock, inviting disorder. The Halloways, he said, had been preserved, tightened, made strong through refusal. He spoke of their mother not as a woman, but as a vessel that had failed to bear the weight of what she carried. In the cellar, the truth took on a different shape. Annalise understood what had been done to her long before she understood why it would never end. She remembered the faces at family gatherings, the shared features that repeated too closely. She remembered the warnings she had ignored because they came wrapped in familiarity. When Orville spoke of sickness, she recognized it for what it was, fear curdled into doctrine. The twins were brought below more often after that, not to listen, but to speak. Orville instructed them to recite passages through the door, their voices steady, their words stripped of warmth. They were told to remind her of her place in the order of things, of her debt, of the sin she embodied simply by existing. Elias read from the ledger. Silas kept his hand on the bolt. Something shifted then. The boys' voices no longer trembled. The sounds from below changed in response, growing hoarse, then thin. The counting slowed. Marks overlapped where strength failed. Above, Orville wrote with satisfaction about progress, about compliance, about how even corrupted blood could be made to submit. The town noticed nothing. Incest was a word, whispered only when outsiders were involved. What happened within a family was considered its own affair. The Halloways continued to pay their debts. The twins continued to stand on the porch, their faces calm, their bodies aligned. The photograph captured them at the height of this balance. Two young men holding a secret so dense it bent everything around it, including the light. When the town innerly reacted, it was not out of compassion. It was fear, sharpened by rumor and wrapped in righteousness. By the late 1870s, the air around the Halloway farm had changed. People spoke the name more quietly. Dogs refused to cross the property line. Children were pulled indoors when the twins passed on the road, their identical silhouettes moving in lockstep, their eyes fixed forward, their mouths set in the same thin line. It was the church that moved first, not with questions, but with conclusions. Reverend Abernathy preached sermons heavy with implication, speaking of houses built on hidden sin, of blood crying out from the ground. He never named the Halloways, but everyone knew. When he finally went to the farm, he did not go alone. Two elders accompanied him, their faces tight with resolve. They were not invited inside. Orville met them on the porch, the twins flanking him like pillars. He spoke calmly, quoting scripture with practiced ease. He insisted that his household was in order, that his authority as head of the family was divinely sanctioned. When the Reverend asked about Annalise, Orville's expression did not change. She was beyond help, he said, beyond earthly intervention. To interfere would be to rebel against God's design. The elders heard something in his voice that chilled them. Not grief, not even anger, certainty. They left without pressing further. That night, the church records show a special meeting called. The minutes are sparse, but the decision is clear. The matter would not be pursued through law. Law required proof. Proof required witnesses. Witnesses required entry. Instead, the elders agreed on containment of their own. Silence, distance, a cordon of social exclusion. The Halloway farm was avoided. Trade was conducted at arm's length. No one stayed long enough to see the windows up close. No one asked about the cellar. Years passed. The twins aged into men without changing shape. Orville grew thinner, his beard streaked with white, his handwriting in the ledger tightening as if the page itself resisted him. Below, the counting stopped one winter. The marks ended mid-sequence. There was no announcement, no funeral bell. When the sound from beneath the floorboard ceased entirely, the house above felt larger, emptier, but no lighter. Annalise's death was recorded as wasting sickness. The paper carried Orville's signature. That was enough. Afterward, the farm changed. The cellar was sealed, fresh earth packed hard against the walls. The twins no longer went below. They stood on the porch more often, as if guarding something that no longer needed guarding. The town exhaled, convinced that whatever had been wrong had resolved itself. But resolution did not mean absolution. When Orville died, the twins did not cry. They buried him without ceremony, their movements precise, their expressions unchanged. They never married, they never left. The house aged around them, boards warping, paint peeling, the window glass clouding but never breaking. What had been done there was never spoken of aloud, but it lived on in avoidance, in the way people crossed themselves when passing the road, in the way the land itself seemed reluctant to forget. Time buried the Halloway farm without ever truly covering it. By the mid-20th century, the house stood empty, its roof sagging, its porch boards grayed and soft beneath the weight of decades. The twins were gone by then, their deaths recorded years apart, both listed as unmarried, both described as quiet men of sound mind. No me was made of where they went after the farm was sold, only that they had lived together until the end. Whatever remained of their father's ledger disappeared into private hands, its contents reduced to rumor. The photographs survived by accident. In the 1980s, when small museums across the Ozarks began cataloging family donations, a box arrived at the Stone County Historical Archive with no return address. Inside were brittle letters, land receipts, and one carefully wrapped photograph. 2 young men on a porch. The archivist logged it, labeled it, and placed it in a drawer among hundreds like it. There it stayed for years, unremarked, unseen. It was a genealogist who noticed the pattern first. Not the image itself, but the names attached to it. While tracing intermarried families and the region, she found the same surnames looping back through generations, converging again and again at the Halloway line. Cousins marrying cousins, uncles marrying nieces, records amended, names misspelled, ages shifted just enough to dull suspicion. The tree did not grow outward. It collapsed inward, tightening with each generation. Curiosity led her to the archive. She requested the photograph. pH as context, as texture for her research. Under magnification, the peaceful composition failed. The glass behind the twins caught light at an angle that revealed something the naked eye missed. A face, distorted, pale, pressed too close, a hand against the pane, and marks, not random, counted. The genealogist stopped her work for the day. She returned with a historian who specialized in rural, religious movements. Together, they pulled property surveys, church minutes, death certificates. They found the memo from the 1950s ordering the photograph removed from display. They found the self-certified death. They found the gap in medical records that stretched 15 years long. Piece by piece, the shape of the story emerged, incomplete but unmistakable. When they visited the land where the house had stood, there was nothing left but a shallow depression and a scatter of stones. The cellar had collapsed inward, its entrance sealed by earth and roots. But the ground there felt different, compacted, resistant, as if it remembered pressure. The archivists debated what to do. Some argued the story was too old, too disturbing, too speculative. Others said silence had already done enough damage. In the end, the photograph was locked away again, labeled restricted. Not destroyed, just hidden. Because some histories are not meant to be resolved, only acknowledged. Even with the photograph and documents hidden, the story refused to die. Whispers carried through the Ozark hills, lingering in the hollows where the wind remembered the shape of the house. Locals spoke of the twins in quiet tones, the kind reserved for those who have glimpsed something unnatural and chose to look away. Some said that late at night, when the moon was low, you could see 2 figures on a hill, standing shoulder to shoulder, unmoving, watching the valley below. Others swore they heard scratching beneath the soil, faint and measured, like the counting that had begun over a century before. By the time researchers in the 1980s traced the Halloway lineage, the horror had already been folded into myth. Family members lived unaware, carrying the names, unaware of the designs of the past. When confronted with the evidence, many recoiled, unwilling to reconcile the truth with the stories they had been told. Yet 1 or 2, like Thomas Halloway, understood that silence Ad preserved not pride, but complicity. That the reverence for ancestors had been misplaced, a shroud that protected murder under the guise of tradition. Genealogists and historians piece together the ledger entries, the blacksmith's receipts, the church diaries, the image of the twins' mother pressed against the glass, her fingers marking each day of captivity, became a symbol of what had been hidden, not just beneath the floorboards of a farmhouse, but beneath generations of accepted civility. Each mark was a testament to the slow erosion of who. When authority is absolute, when love is corrupted, when obedience is taught as virtue, the twins themselves vanished into history like shadows stretching into the forest. No one knew where they went or how they ended, only that the house eventually fell into ruin and the family line scattered. What remained was the legacy of containment, of ritualized devotion turned to violence, of obedi, ents trained into the young, of a mother erased from existence while the world around her remained blissfully unaware. Those who study the Halloways today speak of them in hushed tones. The photograph, when finally shown in restricted circles, provokes the same quiet dread that must have haunted Stone County long ago. Eyes linger on the reflection, imagining the countless days, the tally marks, the silent suffering beneath the floorboards, and in the shadows the landscape seems unwilling to forget, a memory press, ed into the hills themselves.